to keep you all informed. I'd just like to say, please, if you could make sure you don't leave any bags unattended, or also not to reserve seats, as it's a free festival. We want to make sure everyone can have a seat. There's no flash photography permitted in the venue, so if you could turn off the flashes on your cameras, that'd be fantastic. If you're a Twitter user, it would be great if you could let us know what you're saying by using the hashtag ZJLF. Please remember that this is a no smoking zone. There are regulated smoking areas, but not in this venue. If you could refrain, thank you. And there will be a book signing after the event, and if you'd like to get your book signed, you'll need to first purchase it from the Amazon store, and then it will be at the book signing just to our right here. So without further ado, I'll introduce the session. It's entitled Against the Grain, and if you could join me in welcoming to the stage Gideon Levy, Aakar Patel, Salima Hashmi, Swapan Dasgupta, and Meru Gokhale. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Are the mics on here? Okay. Can everyone hear me? No, they're saying they can't hear me.
Mic closer.
Is that better? Okay, great. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our session, which is called Against the Grain, and I have with me four quite difficult to define individuals. So I'm going to not define them too closely and let them do all the talking. So first is Salima Hashmi from Pakistan. She is a writer, an artist, and a human rights activist. And she is most recently the author of a new book on Pakistani art called The Eye Still Seeks. And she is also the daughter of the legendary poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And then we have Gideon Levy, who has been described as, by some people, as the most hated man in Israel, which is some people think. And he is a columnist for the newspaper Haaretz, and he is known for his writings on the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this session, Against the Grain, is named after a documentary which was made on him, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about that quite soon. Then we have next to him Aakar Patel, who is India's most widely read columnist, and he's even more difficult to describe because he is known for his outrageous views on absolutely everything. So I don't actually have any other description for him except that he holds a lot of outrageous views. And he has also translated the nonfiction of Sadat Hasan Manto, and he is about to write, or rather he has just written, but we are about to publish a new book by him on India, which is called The Low Trust Society. And then finally we have Swapan Dasgupta, who many of you are familiar with. He has been a journalist and a broadcaster for over 30 years and is a commentator on Indian politics. He is also one of the most widely read columnists in India. He writes for The Times of India. I have a whole list of all the people he writes for. The Times of India, Telegraph, Pioneer, Jagran, and Asian Age. And he is a doctorate in history from SOAS, and he has quite famously been very, very active in the BJP campaign for the 2014 general election. So I'm going to start with a question for the four of them, and we can then start it off. So the thing which you four have in common I think the most have in common is that you are considered to be contrarian by your peers. You are supposed to have views which are very different from everyone else around you. So can you tell us a little bit about that and the context in which, why do people think you're contrarian? Do you want to start, Salima?
Well, I think,
Can everyone hear?
can everybody hear? A little bit of that is not of my own choosing because you mentioned my lineage. So you can say I was born into a rather contrary family. But then, you know, we considered that we were not contrary, the rest of the world was contrary. So you sort of assume that you're on the right path, track. The fact that, you know, there is this lineage is, eventually that doesn't work, of course. You have to figure out the circumstances in which you do your work. As a visual artist, as a teacher, I think that I found that very often one did go against the conventional. But more than that, it was at times when it was difficult not to make compromises, that you find that what your contrariness is made out of.
But describe it a little bit more. Tell us, you know, a little more about the context in which you were and your family was thought to be.
Well, with the family, it goes without
audience,
saying
yeah.
that, you know, Faiz, because of the fact that he was a poet who was very widely read, both in India and Pakistan. The circumstances in Pakistan were difficult. He went to jail for almost 5 years when I was a child. We always knew that it was because of his beliefs, because it was what he wrote, the fact that Pakistan at that time was very much in the American bloc in the 50s, and as a editor as well, as a journalist as well as a poet, he was considered not a person that could be let loose in society. So one knew that there was a penalty. That was something that you grew up with. Later I found that things that influenced me or were particular to me, the fact of my gender, meant that I participated in demonstrations alongside, and whether it was the Family Rights Bill, but it was also demonstrating as a student against the action on the Suez Canal. Later, when Lumumba was killed, it was for that. So there was, the series of that. But I think it's much later as an adult, when whether it was army action in 1971 or it was the long Zia years, that is when the context of one's art making also took direction. And as a teacher, I felt that I could talk about this. One was independent enough within one's class group to talk about these issues as an intrinsic part of the way that one looked at one's creativity. I mean, during the Zia years, for example, I used to do a course called History of Civilization, and there used to be a guy from the military intelligence sitting in the last row, and there was nothing I could do about it. But that didn't shut me up. So I survived, so that's fine.
Gideon, do you want to tell us a little bit about why people think your views are difficult?
To say the least.
To say the least.
Let me just say a personal word before we start. I'm deeply privileged and honored by the fact that Mr. Shashi Tharoor is with us today. I met Shashi Tharoor many years ago in all kinds of UN conferences. I was praying that he will become the General Secretary of the UN. I think the world and the Middle East would have been a better place to live in if Mr. Tharoor would have been elected. Maybe also my life would have been safer in my country. So I'm really privileged that you found the time in those days to come here. You mentioned this title from The Independent, which asked, is Gideon Levy the most hated Israeli or the most brave or the bravest Israeli? I think I'm neither nor. I'll tell you a word about myself. I was a good boy Israel, a good boy Tel Aviv. I did all the right things. I served in the Israeli army. I did even something which was worse in my eyes today. I worked for 4 years with Shimon Peres, then leader of the Labour Party. I was excited like any other Israeli when in '67 Israel had occupied the West Bank and Gaza. I was part of this nationalistic religious orgy. I was brainwashed like any other Israeli. I was always convinced that the Israelis are always right, the Palestinians are always wrong. I was also convinced that we are the weak ones, the lonely ones, the David against the Goliath, the Palestinians, the Arabs, the rest of the world, and we are the ultimate victims of humankind, not only the ultimate victims, but the only victims in history. Which brings me to this thought that, as you know, there were other occupations in history rather than the Israeli one. There were maybe even more brutal occupations, even though Israel is going quite forward with its brutality. But I don't know one occupation in which the occupier presents himself as the victim, not only the victim, but the only victim. The only victim. I mean, we're getting to a stage in which sanctions are being put on the occupied, international sanctions, as we see now, and the occupier is the ultimate victim. For many years I thought that's the way that things should be, that in one piece of land there should be two peoples living side by side. One people, which is the chosen people, should gain all the rights in the world, and the other people, which was there for hundreds of years, don't deserve any right whatsoever. I thought that this is the way that things should be. That's the way they brought us up. That's the way they wash our brains. That's the way they educate us. That we, the Jewish people, the chosen people, the ultimate victim of history, have rights that no other people have, and for sure not the Palestinian people. And it was only in the late 80s, much before you were born, when I realized that half an hour away from my home, there's a big drama taking place and nobody is there to document it. Namely the Israeli occupation, which is just in our backyard. And gradually I decided to dedicate my professional life to document this reality, which is a very ungrateful job to do in Israel, because no one wants to know, no one wants to tell, and people, the Israeli society is living in a pathological denial about what's going on half an hour away from our homes. In the facade, there is a liberal democracy, and Israel is a liberal democracy for its Jewish citizens. And in the backyard, all this is happening, and Israelis still are sure that this reality in the backyard has nothing to do with the facade, and Israel is the only democracy in the world. Many times I try to tell my fellow Israelis, maybe the IDF, the Israeli army, is not the most moral army in the world. Maybe it's the second moral army in the world. Maybe the army of Luxembourg is more moral. You don't know how they get offended. How can you dare, you traitor? You really dare to say that the Israeli army is not the most moral army? We do so many efforts to prevent killing of children and women and civilians. By mistake, you know, it happens that 200 women, 200 children in the last operation in Gaza, but we had never an intention to do it, never. So I cannot live with this reality. Just to sum up, many years ago I realized that I cannot live with this reality. I cannot ignore it. I cannot close my eyes like most of the Israelis do when this brutal regime, and let's call it by its name, the Israeli occupation is today one of the most brutal tyrannies in the world. One of the most brutal tyrannies in the world, and believe me, I know what I say. So it's very nice to live in the only democracy in the Middle East, and I enjoy all the freedom, even though in the last war I needed a bodyguard to protect my life after a certain article that I wrote. Maybe we'll get into it later. But I am not ready to ignore it. I am not ready to keep silent. And I continue to do what any journalist should do. Just to inform, just to document, just to tell the Israelis what is going on their behalf, on each of our behalf. It's not just the settlers, it's not just the army, it's not just the secret services. We are all part of what is happening so close to our homes, and what we are so ignorant, blind, apathetic, without any moral doubts about our right to do those things. So this is the mission I took upon myself. I keep on doing it. For most of the Israelis, this means treason. This means not being a patriot, even though I consider myself as an Israeli patriot, which most of the Israelis would laugh at me if I say so. I care a lot about Israel. I'm very attached to Israel. I was born there and I will never leave Israel. But I cannot live with an unjust Israel. And Israel is today a very unjust place. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, for those very strong words. And I'm going to come back to one of the things which you said in a minute. But for now, I'm going to ask Aakar to speak a little bit about why people consider him to be contrarian.
My view,
Can everybody hear him, Aakar Patel?
Am I audible? Now, okay. My view is that the problems of this country lie not in government but in society. And I think if you take that as your starting point, almost anything you say will sound a contrarian, will sound offensive. For example, only 3% in this nation of thieves pays any income tax. But if you were to listen to television debate, you would think all of the problems we have with corruption reside in politics. But I don't think that the problem of this country is its politicians. And I think the stage doesn't really interest me, the actors on the stage, whether Manmohan or Modi or whoever else. I'm far more interested in the audience and what the audience is saying, what the audience is doing. But in a nationalistic country that in many ways resembles his, I think it's difficult to say to people that this is what we are, this is who we are. Because the idea that we are this fantastic, forward-looking superpower is so ingrained in the middle class that it's difficult for them to hear what the reality is, or what I think the reality is. I'm perfectly willing to accept I'm wrong many times. The other reason why what I write is not taken often kindly is that I write about caste, which I'm endlessly fascinated in. I think that it's not possible to understand India or South Asia without penetrating caste, but it's not a fashionable subject. I don't think in 2015 we want to hear about people as being from one particular type or the other. But the data doesn't show us that. If you look at just to give an example, if you look at the names of the convicts in the 4 cases that have been adjudicated in the Gujarat riots, Od, Deepra Darwaja, 33 out of 34 of them are Patels, 17 out of 18 of them are Patels. There are certain communities that do the butchering and the slaughtering. Why do they do that? If you look at who are the people who are butchering daughters, the Jats and the Patels. If you look at the data, it is not Gujaratis as a whole, it is not Haryanvis as a whole. It is very small communities that give a bad name to all of them. I'm saying that to look at that data as a journalist, in this country you can find endless amounts of it. And very few people tend to be interested in it. I am, and I think because of that one reason, much of what I write is disliked.
Thank you, Aakar. Swapan Dasgupta has been a supporter of the BJP through 10 years of UPA rule. and it was not a very popular position to have been in, to have stood by for such a long time. Not many people stood by that position. And so can you tell us a little bit about that, Swapan?
Yeah, well, first a correction, Meru. I think I've been a supporter of this party since 1990.
Yes, that's correct.
Which sort of dates back, and I think the problems originate. But I think when you're talking about contrariness, contrarians, I think it depends so much on the context. And when I was hearing Gideon Levy, it struck me that the positions which he very eloquently articulated would not have been considered part of the fringe in India. He would have been celebrated as part of the great Afro-Asian solidarity, and being anti-Israel is extremely fashionable. What was not fashionable is the positions which people like me have taken, which is to be resolutely pro-Israel for a very, very long time. So it again depends on the particular context in which you're looking at. What is contrary in one society is mainstream in another society. Now, I was quite fascinated, therefore, with his talk, because what he set out was, here is a minority position in a society which thinks of him as unpatriotic, anti-state, treacherous, etc. In India, we have a very, very different situation, and the problems which I have encountered, primarily writing in the English language, is that I have had very little problem with society as a whole. I've had problems, and a considerable degree of problems, with the English-speaking elite in this country. Because that elite, sometimes they call themselves cosmopolitan, sometimes they call themselves liberal. The labels are not very important. But I think they have a self-image of being progressive, of being 2 steps ahead of the rest of society. And it's marked by a degree of condescension. And when you deviate from that, and actually you articulate positions which I loosely call the position of Middle India, perhaps articulate the vernacular position in the English language, you become a traitor to your own class. And that's really been the problem all along, in my thinking. Not a problem of being a contrarian with the rest of society, but being a contrarian in terms of your peer group. I recall very, one of the early days of the Jaipur Literary Festival, a festival which I really quite enjoy. I think it was the second year, but it was a very tiny affair at that time. And invariably in those days, they used to have the concluding debate, and I was obviously the token person from the right who's to be wheeled in, because I'd been to the right school and right college, and I knew the right people all along. So it's the sort of Kim Philby phenomena. You've betrayed your class. How could you, of all people, how could you support the Ayodhya movement? Well, I did, and I have no regrets about it. The point is, what was contrarian at that time has become woefully mainstream today. So people often equate me as part, so what are you doing in a contrarian session? Aren't you a part of the establishment? Well, willy-nilly you have become a part of the establishment. But no thanks to the cosmopolitan elite, who really hate you because you said all the wrong things all along and consistently, and you said it in English. That was the problem.
Thank you, Swapan. I just want to pick up on one of the things which you said, and then maybe the other panelists can also talk about that, because you yourself are a member of the English-speaking elite of this country, and the context in which you grew up and your peer group, what made you have such a different view about things than everybody else, and that's something I really want to ask everybody else as well.
Well, for everybody, it's a voyage of self-discovery, it's a voyage of evolution.
Tell us
I don't think
about
people are born in one way or the other. I spent my student days being very much on the left, and that journey, which is not unique by any circumstances, happened. And I think these are personal experiences. What it is, what triggers that change it's a very personal experience. It's not something I would necessarily. But it's, there are certain journeys which are deemed legitimate. If a person from the left becomes, as Shashi has, being Nehruvian, that's acceptable. But if a person from the left goes and embraces the right, as it's called, articulates nationalism of a thing, that's not on. Can you imagine? I mean, in 1990, I wrote an article in the Times of India editorial page, saying why the mobilization around the Ayodhya is probably one of the greatest mass mobilizations we've ever seen. And it was a fairly sympathetic view of that. 20 academics from Delhi University and JNU, including some of what are called the eminent historians, wrote, why is this man being given a platform? Here are the people who write Charlie, whatever it is, they go around, they talk about freedom of press. So there is that thing, and therefore certain journeys are considered legitimate, certain journeys are not considered legitimate, and all of which are deemed. There are the certifying engineers of correctness, and they dictate what is correct and what is not.
I think Swapan is not answering the question, but we'll let him go.
It's a personal experience.
No, fair enough. And Aakar, you are a Gujarati, and your views are quite different from your peers in Gujarat. So can you tell us what made you,
I'll just respond.
What in your personal experience?
The problem of being completely close-minded is a problem in South Asia of the vernacular languages. In English, he and I are fortunate to write to an audience which might be close-minded in small ways, as he says, that they tend not to look at the Babri Masjid episode fondly. But I cannot write about Hindutva in any paper in Gujarat today. It is unacceptable. You can't do it. I write a column for the oldest newspaper in South Asia. It's called the Bombay Samachar, owned by Parsis, and it is in Gujarati. Each Sunday, when the editor briefed me, he said, I will not, koi pan anti-Hindu vastu vaprish nahi. I won't take any anti-Hindu writing. I said, why should I write? I should have asked him. I don't write against Hindus, but that's not what he meant. What he meant was, don't write about the riots, don't write about Muslims, don't write about violence, because our readers don't want that. He will testify to this. India Today had to shut down its Gujarati edition because it ran a cover after the Babri Masjid episode saying this was something shameful. Gujaratis unsubscribed in such numbers, they had to shut it down. So I'm saying that what he and I, what Salima can get away with in English on the subcontinent, we cannot get away with in Urdu. I write for an Urdu paper. If I write something on, say, Muslim law, they'll just drop the column for the week. It's not as if they will want to edit it, they'll want to do something. If I write about the problem of Ahmadis in Pakistan, they will not, this is a paper in India, they will not carry it. Because there is a social consensus in the language that is so powerful that we are fortunate to have English come and save us. This is the only language in which you can truly express yourself freely and liberally in India. Whether by liberal you mean somebody like him who goes against the grain of his, or like me. We are fortunate to have this language with us.
Thank you, Aakar. Gideon, I want you to come back to how you described your childhood and your growing up and your experiences, which you said you did all the right things. You did all the things you were supposed to do. So what made you change your mind? And you used the word brainwashed as well. And so what made you go against the grain in that particular case?
Most of the Israelis will have a very simple answer. He just got out of his mind. And they would think that the answer should be found by a psychiatrist, not by anyone else. I think that in my case, the answer is very, very simple. I just opened my eyes. I just started to travel to the occupied territories, which most of the Israelis
And
don't.
is it true that you, as an Israeli, that you are not, you're encouraged to not go to any of those territories? And
Absolutely. It's not only encouraged, in many cases it's forbidden. I was just arrested 2 weeks ago because I broke this
how did you make your
law.
first journey to when you knew that that it is impossible to go there? How did you start doing it?
Gradually. I didn't have an agenda then. I just really accidentally, a friend called me and told me there are some olive trees being uprooted in the West Bank. Let's go and see what happened there. It was back in '87, and it was really, in those terms then, it was a huge story, but today nobody would bother. Uprooting olive trees is a daily action in the West Bank. And it was a very gradual process in which, on one hand, I realized what's going on there, and in the other hand, I realized there is nobody to tell it. I always say all my stories are always exclusive. I mean, journalists always dream to be exclusive. I'm exclusive because nobody goes there, nobody wants to tell the story, nobody dares to tell the story. And it was a very gradual process. It's not like one day I saw the light or one day I saw the darkness. It was gradual, and gradually I realized how big is the drama, how deep is the injustice, and how blind, ignorant, and apathetic are most of the Israelis. And then in a certain stage, after a few years of doing it, you know, in a hesitating step, my views also became more and more radical. I changed my views dramatically
And how did
to
the
the
people
opposite direction
around
of
you
yours.
react?
Sorry?
How did the people around you react with your changing views? Your family, your friends, how did they react to you? Did they try to change your mind? Did they?
Come and walk with me in the streets of Tel Aviv. The other day, they did a few weeks ago after the operation in Gaza, I was guest in Hard Talk of the BBC. And before we started the interview, Stephen Sacker, the interviewer, took me around. We walked around the promenade of Tel Aviv, and in those days, emotions were very hot against me, and people started to scream at me, and he shot all this. And then came this woman and told him this sentence, which until today is still in my mind. You know what she told him? The problem in Israel is that there is too much democracy. And I thought half of the world is struggling for freedom, for democracy, for more democracy. And here comes this spoiled Israeli who complains about too much democracy. So, but I want to point out one important point. Answering your question, family tolerated me. I mean, my sons write in Facebook all kind of statuses against me in many ways, but they love me as a father. I mean, and I can't be a friend of someone who does not share the same views, because it's not only about views, it's really about, in my view, about morality. And I can't be a friend, so my social small circle is for sure of people who share my views. My partner is Swedish, so it's much easier to look at it from the outside, but she's as critical as me, and many times she's the brain behind me. But what is important to mention here is that at least until now, I gained total freedom in Israel. The pressure that I face, the people who spit at me, the people who curse me, the people who attack me or threaten me, they are coming from the public. But no pressure, neither from the government, nor from the army, from the secret services, from any of the governmental institutions, and total freedom and support from my own newspaper. This should not be taken for granted, because in many countries this couldn't have taken place. So from this point of view, I'm really privileged. I face those popular, this popular hatred, and it is in terms of hatred right now, but I gain support and freedom, which I don't know if it will last forever, but at least for the time being, this is the case.
On that note, I'm going to ask Salima Hashmi, because you made a point about pressure from the government, pressure from newspapers. You spoke a little bit about you were a young girl when your father was put in prison. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, and also about, pick up on the point which Gideon Levy just made about the environment in which you speak, the environment in which you write, the environment in which you paint? How does that affect what you say, and does it matter which country it is that you go against the grain? Is it easier for Swapan and Aakar to be contrarian than it is for you and Gideon?
Well, I think that's something that Gideon just said struck me, because I was taken back in time. You know, from being a household which was always thronged by people, whether they were journalists, or they were musicians, or they were writers, or they were just, you know, people who, a very lively home. Suddenly, your father is declared a traitor and a conspirator against the state, and it is as though the world has disappeared. And you're left, you know, with the immediate family, my mother, my sister, an aunt who was brave enough to come in with us, and sometimes my grandmother. And there is no one. You suddenly have no friends. I remember I was, and because there was a complete blank, we didn't know where he was where he had gone, who had.
And you were 8 years old?
I was 8 years old. I was 8.5. My sister was 4 years old, and it was strange because there was no way. There was an opaque wall. There was no one to contact to find out where he was. It was complete disappearance. And strangely, my mother got word after about 2 months from somebody that he was okay. Because we would get phone calls saying, you know, we are torturing him, telling my mother, tell us what you know, we are putting him on ice, you better say, and you know, she put down the phone. Even if I picked it up, I would hear somebody say this. So we had no notion of what had happened to him. I went to a birthday party because I was a very shy, retiring child. My mother insisted, you know, you go to this birthday party. When I arrived there, I was taken to another room where there was a table and there were these very solemn looking men sitting there. They sat me down and they said, where is your father? So I said, I don't know where my father is, but I know that he's all right, because I remember my mother had said he's all right. So they said, how did you hear? And then I realized I'd said something wrong. I shouldn't have said he's all right, because they would know that we knew he was all right. So anyway, I joined the party. When I came home, I said, I never want to go to another birthday party. And so my mother, you know, prodded and found out, and she rang up the family and she gave them hell. But that was the kind of atmosphere. But the thing is, you know, with hindsight, you learn so much. You learn about loyalty, you learn about disloyalty, you learn about friendships, and you suddenly see what real values are about. Because my mother explained to my daughter, my sister and me, your father has not done anything wrong, he was not a criminal, he's standing up for something he believes in. But you know, it's very difficult for a little child. You go to school and people say, oh, so your father's in jail. And you know, you don't know what to say to that. But I mean, that was a childhood experience which certainly tells you about difficult upbringings and people living in a country which has had a trajectory, a political trajectory of military dictatorships for a large part of its history. You understand what other people go through who've had similar experiences and worse. I think so in that way I'm not something special. You know, there are many people, and we've certainly seen in the most brutal of military dictatorship, which was the Zia era. I mean, you know, young boys, because they're giving out pamphlets on a bus, are taken to court-martial and they are condemned to death within 36 hours. So one has been through that kind of a political history also, which brings us to this question of democracy. You know, what happens in a political history like that is people develop a self-censorship. They develop at large they developed, also come to believe in or accept dictatorial behavior in all kinds of aspects, through the bureaucrat, through what the politician does or the ruler does. Then it becomes part of the way of public behavior. And it continues. It takes you a very, very long time, I think, to accept there is another way of collective, responsible social behavior.
Thank you for sharing that incredibly moving story. I've just been told we have 5 minutes, so I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to ask our other 3 panelists to share an experience of, a personal experience in which going against their grain put them in danger or put them in an awkward situation. And I'd love to hear a personal experience from all of you, but we'd have to be quite quick because we need to open up the questions. So I don't mind who goes first. Would you like to go? Yeah.
I just want to say before we get to the personal story, let's just remember that history is full with many, many more examples of individuals who were chased, who were in small minorities, who were being considered as traitors, who in perspective are perceived as the right ones, and with brainwashed majorities which were wrong, which were taken wrong. This should be back in our mind. The anecdote that I would like to share with you, I'll try to do this short as possible, but it's a very meaningful one in the terms of it shows the way of thinking in Israel. It was one of the days in the Intifada years, in the uprising years, when I arrived in a checkpoint next to the city of Jenin, a Palestinian city, which was all under siege. I came from inside Jenin. There was a Palestinian ambulance standing in front of me. I stood behind him. The red lights were on and waiting. The soldiers were playing backgammon in their tent. I waited 15 minutes, half an hour. I usually don't go out of the car because I'm very easy to lose my temper in those situations, and it might become dangerous. But after half an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. So I got out, and first I went to the ambulance driver and I asked him what's going on. He said, that's the rule. He said it in Hebrew, even though he was Palestinian. They dry us for 1 hour before they come to check us. This freaked me out in such a way that I had to go to the soldiers. And what freaked out the soldiers, I started screaming at them. They screamed at me. But what brought them really to direct their weapons toward me was one question that I asked them. And that's a question that an Israeli never is ready to be asked and never asked himself. I asked them, what would have happened if your father would have been in this ambulance and some soldiers would have prevented the ambulance of passing for 1 hour without even checking it? This freaked them out, because how can you dare to compare my father to anyone who lies in this Palestinian ambulance? Because dehumanization got such a stage in which a Palestinian ambulance is a non-human being in their eyes. Otherwise, they wouldn't play backgammon. Otherwise, they maybe wouldn't have served there. So this moment when they directed their weapons at me, and it was really dangerous because they were young and very, very angry and they could do something. At this moment, I understood that that's the question that should be asked forever.
Thank you for sharing that.
Writers here don't face the sort of dangers they do either in Pakistan or in Israel. They're very, very brave journalists in those two countries, and I don't think we have, fortunately, not had the kind of subject to go up against that they have, for the most part. I don't have any stories of valor or courage, and I have not been threatened as far as I know. The first time I met the Prime Minister in 2001, he took me to the side. He's a very humorous, very warm man, and spoke to me in Gujarati. And we had just fired somebody for writing an editorial in the paper that I worked for this was the Gujarati edition which had supported the riots, and I had fired that man, and I had met Mr. Modi 2 or 3 days after that, and he knew the backgrounds, and he took me to the side and he held my hand in the way that Indian men hold their hands, and he said, Saurabh bhai saffron, Aakar bhai red, meaning that I was the communist who had sacked the man who was on his side in the team. A few months ago, I met somebody from the BJP, quite senior, and he said to me that the Prime Minister had asked him not to meet me again. And I asked him why was that. So he said he's from the ISI. So now I turned green. So the only color left for me is saffron.
Thank you, Aakar. Swapan, last word to you. Can you very quickly share an anecdote so that we can open up the floor to questions?
No, I tend to agree with Aakar that I don't think we are living in such a polarized world where we have state oppression. But I think really the issue that really rankles in my mind is that after 1990, I lost a very large number of friends with whom I'd grown up. And political differences imposed a gulf, which I don't think they should. So perforce, I had to acquire a new set of friends. And it makes me very sad that in India, we see political positions as being so rigid as normal social interaction isn't possible. And more than anything else, that's the point which I regret most. And I think that's something which is not exclusive to one side. It also extends to the other side. And I think when we talk about creating a rather more enlightened society, I think we should recognize that political differences will be there. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is a democracy. Everyone can't think alike. And we have to engage. We have to influence each other or not influence each other. Maybe debate, berate, mock, but that's part of the general tradition. So I think my sort of submission would be that let this closed mind attitude be removed. Let this word contrarian actually disappear. I mean, people will have different views.
Thank you very much, Swapan, and thank you to our audience for being such good listeners. We have a question from the gentleman over there. And can,
Hello.
excuse me,
Yeah.
Can you give it to that gentleman after that?
मेरा सवाल आकार पटेल जी से है. Sir, I'd like to say कि टाइम्स ऑफ इंडिया के एक स्पेशल एडिशन को या टाइम्स ऑफ इंडिया को बैन कर दिया गया वहाँ श्री राम जन्मभूमि आंदोलन के समय जब आपने कोई एक ऐसा एडिशन लिखा तो ऐसा आपको ही क्यों लगता है कि जैसा आपने लिखा वैसा सही था और बहुत सारे लोगों ने वो अनसब्सक्राइब कर दिया इसलिए वो सारे के सारे गलत हो गए? या एक हिंदुस्तान की एक बहुत बड़ी जनसंख्या जब ये कहती है कि भारत माता की जय या भारत हिंदू राष्ट्र है, या फिर आपको उसमें ऐसा क्यों लगता है कि उसमें मुसलमान या पारसी या ईसाई या क्रिश्चियन या बौद्ध या जैन या सिख शामिल नहीं है और आप उसको अपनी ही निगाह से देख करके सामने वाले को गलत ठहराना चाहते हैं?
नहीं, मेरे नज़दीक ये कतई गलत नहीं कि आप अपना सब्सक्रिप्शन खींचे या आप कुछ कहे जो मुझे लगे कि ठीक ना हो, आपको बिल्कुल ये हक है। मैं ये मानने को तैयार हूँ कि जो नज़रियात में जो लिबरल लोग हैं उनका जो नज़रिया है सिर्फ वही ठीक है, ये मैं नहीं मानता। पर ये मैं बिल्कुल मानता हूँ कि कुछ ज़ुबानों में हमारी डिबेट बंद हो जाती है और गुजराती उन ज़ुबानों में से एक है। और ये टाइम्स ऑफ इंडिया की बात नहीं, ये मैगज़ीन था इंडिया टुडे।
Thank you. Can we have the next question? And also, I'd just like to request the audience to keep the questions brief and also to keep them as questions and not statements, please.
Hello. Yeah, my question is for...
Can you give your name, please?
My name is Mihir Sharma. My question is for Swapan. Swapan, it has been reported, and I know you probably can't comment, that you may on Monday be receiving a Padma Award, which is what we in India call our knighthoods. I was just wondering, as somebody who is now so much clearly a man of the mainstream, in fact, a leading light of the establishments that we will have for the next, yug.
Hopefully.
Yes. At what point can you stop thinking of being called a contrarian and accept that you are, in fact, mainstream?
Well, since Mihir Sharma has asked me this question, a few days ago I was privileged to be invited to a party, very, very agreeable party, which was in honor of Mihir's book. Now, Mihir is a very well-known columnist, etc., etc. Now, imagine my great surprise when I find that of all the sort of notables who'd been invited, the beautiful people, I happen to be the only one who could be said to belong to a political persuasion. Now, Mihir Sharma, you are the establishment, you are the intellectual establishment. You control the levers of opinion. You control the power over the English language media. Where do I fit in? And at least the only good thing about the knighthood, as I keep telling, is that hopefully a lot of people call me Swapan sir. So I said, well, one day I hope it'll be a prefix.
Thank you. Thank you. This gentleman over here.
Yeah, my name is Mohit Satyanan, and this is for Swapan sir and Aakar.
Sir Swapan.
Sir Swapan. No, that's what he hopes it will become one day. People who learn English abandon their parents. Do you see a resentment about those who are empowered with English? And do you see a move against this in the new establishment?
I would say yes. I think that we tend to look on our parents differently and tend not to do ancestor worship the more you get into the Occidental tradition of learning. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, you see, I'm one of those who considers myself to be an orphan of Macaulay. I'm not a child of Macaulay, I'm really orphaned by him.
Macaulay's orphan.
English is the only language which I'm totally proficient in. But I think English does bring with you a certain set of attitudes. And on a lot of occasions, they are in conflict with certain other understanding of society. And I think that's inevitable. The point is to consciously realize the points of conflict.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll have to continue conversations later. There's a lady over there. Can you give your name, please, and speak up?
Yeah, my name is Savitri Horowitz. I'm from Jerusalem. And my question, of course, is to Gideon. There are a number of things with what he said is, I find not only factually incorrect, but my question to you is that you represent a point of view from Israelis from Tel Aviv. I live in Jerusalem and we mix with Palestinians. I don't know why you think you can't go into the West Bank, because I go into the West Bank almost 3 times a week without any problems. But my question to you is, when you talk about Israel as being like the worst of this and the worst of that, is that kind of a arrogance that you show, that why does Israel have to be better than anybody else? Isn't that a sort of a twisted way? Is there one country in this world that is so moral? Is there one perfect country in this world? Every country in this world has some kind of history where we are not fair to the people we live in. So why do you think that Israel has to be better than everybody else, and especially in the neighborhood where we live, where you have ISIS and Syria and Iran and Iraq and all that stuff that goes on there?
I always envy people who are so self-contented and happy about what's going on and are totally convinced that things not only are like this, should be like this. I never say that Israel should be better than any other place. We are so far off it. Let us just be like some other countries. This will be fair enough. And anyone can portray any kind of picture about Israel, but there are some facts that nobody can contradict. namely that Israel is occupying for the last over 40 years another people in a very brutal, aggressive way, against their will, people who don't gain any civil rights whatsoever. This fact cannot be contradicted. Nothing can contradict the fact that in Israel, in the backyard of Israel, there is a very clear apartheid regime, not in Israel, in the backyard of Israel, because if it looks like apartheid, if it walks like apartheid, if it talks like apartheid, it is apartheid. And I'm very happy that you go to the Palestinian parts of Jerusalem. I wonder, when have you been last time in Shuafat refugee camp, which is part of Jerusalem? I wonder, when have you been last time in Essaouira, which is part of Jerusalem? And if this does not remind you Alexandra or Soweto, so what can remind you of Alexandra or Soweto?
We have time for 2 more questions. There's a lady at the back, and then we'll do 1 more question. I'm sorry, there's no time for answers from the audience. You'll have to continue that afterwards. Otherwise, people won't get enough time. Please go ahead and please tell us your name. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. My name's Charlotte.
Can the audience hear?
Louder.
My name is Charlotte. Can you hear me now? I wanted to ask you, thank you very much for a great session. I wanted to ask you about the case of Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, which I'm sure you're all familiar with to some degree. I think that, do you feel that social media and the fact that we get the messages further now gives any support to people who want to express a contrarian view? Do you think there's any benefit to the so-called globalization of the media, or do you think it's, again, English-speaking liberal luxury, which actually is not really playing a real part in giving people the opportunity for freedom of expression, or supporting those who are penalized for freedom of expression?
Who would like to take the question? Salima?
Go ahead, get the question. You want me to?
Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. People use the social media in different ways. I mean, I'm one of those people who believes that social media has a multiplier effect in terms of your views, and I'm very privileged to use it. I really don't know how sort of less publicized causes are being able to, but certainly the case of what's been happening to that gentleman in Saudi Arabia has been popularized far more courtesy the social media than would have normally been the case. So it's now a complement, and it's now an essential part of the natural discourse. So I think the term social media, sooner or rather than later, that distinction will be obliterated. It will become part of the normal conversation, and I think it's already happening in a big way.
Thank you, Swapan. We're about to take the last question, and before we do, I just want to thank you all for being a wonderful audience and listening to us. Please go ahead and tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Udit Thakur. I'm a journalist. This question is to everybody on the panel. Would you say, to what degree would you say that your individual levels of truth-telling have either become divorced or more conjoined with the idea of consensus building? To what degree would you say that it's become self-indulgent versus constructive?
To what can you just repeat the last bit of your question? To what
extent do you think that some of your criticisms have become, each of you individually, have become self-indulgent, so-called trolling, or constructive to building a larger consensus?
I think that in Pakistan's context, right now, my views of people like me, they are still very much, we're very much in danger right now, because there is a high level of conflict, there's a high level of violence, and certain people represent certain views which are, though we ask for, we expect to be protected, or we expect safety, but we know that it's not possible for state to give us safety. Therefore, it becomes more perilous to hold certain views. And I mean, I'm not particularly high profile in that way, but the simple fact that you represent a point of view is difficult to sustain in our current circumstances of violence and, well, terrorism.
Thank you. I think Gideon Levy wants to say something.
I never ask myself those questions. Many times people tell me, be more moderate, cover it with a more friendly cover, and then you reach more people. I'm not a politician. In any case, I'm a total failure in convincing my fellow Israelis. The dogs are barking, the convoy is running exactly to the opposite direction. So many years ago, I decided I write, and I know it's high words, but it's not just a cliche. I really write what I think, and I don't take into consideration none of those considerations. I'll give you one example, and by this I'll finish. The article, my claim to fame in the last war, was an article that I wrote about the Israeli pilots and their responsibility to crimes of war in Gaza. This created all the mess around me and really became almost dangerous for me. And people told me you could have written the same article but give it a less provocative title, No, we are there to shake. We are there to give a message which is many times not convenient. Journalism is not about amusing the readership. Journalism is about shaking them if it's needed. And therefore, all those considerations are not my consideration. If one day I'll go for politics, even though it doesn't seem so, then maybe I will make those considerations. As a journalist, no way.
Thank you.
Those who write regularly will know that the act of writing, especially if you do it every day, can't be faked. That you can't impose somebody else's thoughts. You can't really force yourself to say something you don't really feel like saying. And for those of us who write every day, we might have a bit of mischief, or we might be wrong often. But to say that we deliberately fake it, I don't think really makes sense.
You know, somewhere out there is an elusive category called consensus. But on 9 out of 10 times, that turns out to be a celebration of mediocrity, and I'd rather not have anything to do with it.
Wonderful.
On that note, I'd like to thank our panelists, Swapan Dasgupta, Aakar Patel, Gideon Levy, and Salima Hashmi. Please give them a big hand, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.